Betty timidly sat on the edge of the bed. A heavy sigh escaped her chest. Her mother had been right. Holding on to something too tightly, you risk losing it. The full depth, the overwhelming pain and injustice of that phrase, Betty only understood today. She looked out the window. The view was breathtaking. Everything just as they had wanted. A picturesque lake, a shore lined with willows leaning toward the water, boats in the distance. Silence and grace, the wise grandeur of nature. Nothing foretold trouble, not a single hint sign, absolutely nothing. For several days now, she and her husband had been vacationing in a small family-owned hotel 300 kilometers from the bustling southern city. Every morning, Stephen went for a run and then swam in the lake. He liked the cold water, into which no one else would dare to venture. Discipline and hardening were paramount to him, and he never broke his routine. It was one of the qualities Betty appreciated most in her husband. Stephen's morning exercise usually took no more than an hour, but today he didn't return after 1 or 2 hours. She couldn't sit still, peering out the window every minute. She even ran to the lake, but it was all in vain. Since his disappearance, only a few hours had passed, just a couple or 3, at most 4. Everyone around said it was too early to worry, that a healthy adult man could go anywhere after his usual morning swim. For example, her Stephen could have gone into the woods just to wander and think. For a typical city dweller, it's better than any therapy. It seemed too early to involve the police. But what would she tell them? My husband has been missing from the hotel room for 4 hours? Yet Betty didn't just feel, she knew for certain that something terrible had happened. In the 6 months since their wedding, Stephen had never given her a reason to worry. He even warned her about minor work delays and reported all his movements. He was a very disciplined and educated man. Betty had also gotten used to writing to him several times a day, telling him where she was going and where she was. At first, such behavior seemed a bit intrusive to her, but her husband assured her that this was how it should be in their family. "I've been searching for you for too long, and now I don't want to lose you," he explained. Honestly, Betty felt the same way. Her first husband lived completely differently throughout their marriage. He could come home from work after midnight without warning, ignoring her calls. It was only later that she learned about his parallel life. She was needed by him as a possession. And who voluntarily deprives themselves of property or status? So, Betty was needed by Andrew as a status symbol for respect in society. There was never any extra money, joint leisure time, or trust in their home. Betty tried alone, setting an ideal frequency in the apartment, timing Andrew's return so that the dinner she prepared for him would definitely be warm. Stephen, on the other hand, treated her feelings and everything Betty did with immense respect. That's why he simply couldn't go anywhere without warning her. And Betty didn't like surprises. And Stephen knew it well, so this version was also dismissed. She stood on the hotel terrace, gripping the railing, gazing into the hazy distance. Nature seemed to echo her mood. The previous days of relaxation had been sunny, but today, low clouds covered the gloomy sky, thickening and threatening to burst with sharp rain. Watch and wait. There was nothing else left to do. Betty mentally promised herself that she would wait until 6 o'clock and then definitely sound the alarm. Although every fiber of her being was already filled with an oppressive, suffocating anxiety. "Hasn't he shown up yet?" She heard a voice behind her and flinched. It was Diane, the hotel owner, who treated every guest as her personal guest. "Not yet," Betty replied in a subdued voice. "I can't wait any longer." "Well, this is also unacceptable, suffocating the man with your care. He's been gone for a few hours and you're already beside yourself." Diane's voice carried a reproach. "But it's not about that, please understand," Betty replied. "He's never disappeared like this without warning me, especially since today we plan to explore the surroundings, go to a restaurant with Stephen." "Well, if that's the case, you need to seek help," Diane agreed with her. Despite her warmth and friendliness, the owner clearly didn't want the police to come to the hotel. Together with her husband Jeffrey, they had spent many years meticulously building a reputation for the safest and quietest place in the region. Their business relied on the long-standing trust of the guests. The lake, by the shore of which the hotel was situated, was very deep, right at the edge. Swimming in it was prohibited by the local authorities. There was no descent or path to the lake from the hotel. But could that stop intrusive tourists or fishermen who casually pitched their tents on the opposite shore and didn't care about the rules? They swam, jumped off cliffs, fished, and often drowned. Unfortunately, Jeffrey and Diane knew how deceptive and dangerous the lake was. That's why they always warned their guests that it was better to admire its beauty from a distance. However, Stephen brushed off the warnings, claiming that swimming in the mornings in a pool or any other body of water was his long-standing habit, which he wasn't going to give up. Stephen was indeed an excellent swimmer, so Betty wasn't worried that her husband was doing it in a dangerous body of water. Not until today, when he left for a run in the morning, kissing her sleepily and never returned. An hour later, Betty finally called the police. She no longer cared what anyone would think. As she expected, her call was reluctantly accepted, with many strange questions asked. But Betty was persistent, and within 40 minutes a police car pulled up to the hotel's main entrance, arousing the expected interest of all its guests. 2 hours later, not only Betty herself but almost all the hotel guests were questioned. And as the police were about to leave, a family with a 6-year-old daughter returned from an excursion. The girl said that in the morning she saw a man in red shorts go to the lake from the balcony, dive into the water, but she didn't notice him coming out of the water. There was no doubt left. Stephen had drowned. He couldn't have gone anywhere wet and in just shorts. An hour later, the vehicles of the emergencies ministry arrived at the lake. The rescuers slowly unpacked equipment and oxygen tanks, reluctantly donned wetsuits, and discussed something for a long time. Betty wanted to run up to them and hurry them along. She wanted to zip up their zippers, unload all those tanks herself, and make them descent into the water as quickly as possible. She understood why the guys weren't in a rush. If Stephen had indeed drowned, then there was no need to hurry anymore. Timothy, the head of the rescue team, stood next to Betty, observing the progress of his team's work. Diane approached them, sincerely hoping that her guest would still turn out to be alive, and that no one would associate their hotel with this tragedy. "I warned you not to go there," Diane grumbled. "Everyone knows the lake is treacherous. For as long as I can remember, so many legends surround it." "And what, have you seen something unusual here?" Timothy glanced at her incredulously. "No, I haven't seen anything, but they say when it surfaces and starts to breathe, the water boils," the woman persisted. "Yes, when you don't learn physics or biology at school, life is full of wonders," the rescuer joked grimly. "The bottom of this lake is muddy, with many karst caves where hydrogen sulfide accumulates and periodically comes to the surface, causing bubbling. There's several meters of silt down there. It engulfs boats so that they can't be reached, let alone people. Completely conceals them. That's all the wonders for you." Betty listened and didn't understand what these people were talking about, what monsters, what caves. The harmless mirror-like surface of the water didn't hold such horrifying secrets. They had swam in this clear water with Stephen just a few days ago, and now they were telling her that the lake was capable of killing. "How could he have drowned?" Betty whispered through tears. "No currents, nothing. The water's clear. He was a good swimmer, and the shore was close." "Ma'am, I just explained everything to you," Timothy said patiently. "The bottom structure is like that. Imagine, deep under the water, an uneven surface. There are deep mazes. It sucks you in like a whirlpool in a matter of minutes, understand?" The rescuer continued. "No matter how well you swim, you won't cope. I don't want to scare you in advance, but we have several dozen drownings here every season, and we find less than half. That's why swimming here is prohibited, understand?" "Wait until you bury him," Diane protested. "It's only been a few hours. There's no trace of him on the woman's face anymore." All night long, Betty sat on the shore, watching the divers work. Other members of the rescue team combed the surroundings. It wasn't ruled out that Stephen could have gotten lost in the woods, for instance. Betty cursed the day they decided to come here instead of going to the seaside. Betty didn't know how to pray, but the words she mentally addressed to God were the most sincere she'd ever felt. She just couldn't bear to lose her husband. Her first marriage lasted 5 years and ended in a messy divorce, accompanied by scandals and property division, although there wasn't much to divide back then. For nearly 10 years, Betty was alone. Sometimes she tried dating men, but nothing came of it. Betty dedicated all her time to work and achieved significant success in her career. Men she encountered were either greedy or losers who wanted to see her as a free service. Meeting Stephen, Betty realized she wanted to spend her life with such a man until old age. Educated, charming, courageous, he captivated her instantly. Betty suddenly realized all the old, unimportant things were just superficial. Unexpectedly, she and Stephen found spiritual depth and heights together. He was there for her, filling her soul with warmth, and Betty was gradually thawing. And soon after, Stephen proposed to her. After the wedding, the spouses moved to a large house outside the city and were absolutely happy. Betty wasn't yet 40, and she perfectly understood she didn't have many years left to have a child. Stephen also dreamed of a baby. They decided to take a vacation at this small hotel by the lake, and before leaving, they wished that Betty would get pregnant there. Yes, such things couldn't be planned with 100% certainty, but Betty knew that with Stephen by her side, anything was possible in her life. And now, everything shattered overnight. There's no present, no future anymore, and having a child is something she can forget forever. Betty returned to the hotel, where all the guests saw her off with sympathetic glances. For the most part, nobody cared about her, but her personal hell was just beginning. 2 days later, Betty had to go back home. To a huge empty house that meant nothing to her without Stefan. The next day, she was summoned to the investigative committee. Peter, who was handling Stefan's case, told her that the search for her husband was ongoing, but unfortunately, hopes were slim. "As far as I know, your husband insured his life shortly before the trip, right?" the investigator asked. "And you're the beneficiary of the insurance premium in case of his death." Could he really think that Betty had something to do with the tragedy? And for what? For the sake of getting that silly insurance? "Yes, that's correct, but it's a very small amount," Betty protested. "Besides, Stephen disappeared. He didn't die." "I was just clarifying," Peter replied calmly. "And regarding your property, it turns out you're also the sole heir, right?" "Yes, but excuse me, no one has died, have they?" Betty responded. She felt uncomfortable engaging in a dialogue with the investigator and answering his questions. She wanted to leave as soon as possible. Days passed, but there were no results. Betty spent a lot of time with her parents, Jessica and Rick. Her younger sister Shirley, who was 10 years younger, almost every day dropped by, trying to support her. It was getting harder for Betty. The woman's hope was fading, but her heart refused to believe in a tragic outcome. A week later, Peter from the police called Betty and informed her that the authorities had decided to conclude the search and rescue operation. The woman began to scream and curse, demanding that they continue to search for her husband. Peter replied that these decisions were not up to him, and besides, in his personal opinion, further searches were pointless. For 2 days, Betty didn't get out of bed, crying and occasionally falling into a restless, nightmare-filled sleep. Being at home was unbearable. Every object reminded the woman of Stephen. She didn't know what to do next. Fly back to that ill-fated hotel? But she didn't have the money. And what could she do there alone? She needed to find some support, but at the very least, she had to stop crying and eat something. Betty opened her laptop to order some ready-made food, but even the photos of the products made her feel nauseous. Suddenly, on one of the websites, she noticed an advertisement. "Hereditary clairvoyant Janet will help solve all your problems." Without hesitation, Betty clicked on the link and found herself on the website of the fortune teller. The clairvoyant wrote about the gift she inherited from her grandmother and her many years of work and amazing results. Then there were dozens of reviews with photos. Janet helped one lady bring her partying husband back to the family, and another client conceive a child. Betty reread all the stories and decided to turn to this fortune teller. Moreover, at first, she conducted a diagnosis and looked at the tarot cards to assess the situation. Betty called the number provided and made an appointment with the woman. Heading to Janet's place, Betty imagined a majestic lady with black curls and long red nails standing in front of a glowing crystal ball. However, the door in the apartment building was opened by an ordinary, slightly plump woman with her hair tied back. "Hello, are you clairvoyant Janet?" Betty asked in surprise. "Yes, come in," the apartment owner replied shortly. Her dwelling was simple and completely nondescript. Only the table in the middle of the living room revealed the hostess's activity. On it lay icons, wax candles, cards, and several amulets. Please pay up front, Janet said, and Betty placed the pre-prepared banknotes on the table. I explained the whole situation to you over the phone. Do you need any more details? The visitor asked timidly. Just his photo, I'll see the rest myself. Sit across from me and extend your hand, the fortune teller commanded, lighting a candle. In the next moment, she pulled out intricately designed cards from a beautiful box. All right, close your eyes and don't open them until I say, Janet instructed. Betty felt the room fill with a cloying scent of melting wax, mixed with some strange aromas. Janet took her hand and began to emit monotonous sounds resembling meditative chanting. After a few minutes, Betty, who had been feeling unwell since morning, began to feel nauseous. But she didn't dare to open her eyes or say anything, and suddenly she felt overwhelmed by heat. It was as if the room around her was on fire, and she was at the center of this infernal hell. Open your eyes, commanded the clairvoyant. So, did you feel it? What exactly? Betty whispered uncertainly. Your husband is alive, Janet confidently replied, not taking her eyes off her client. I sensed his impulse. All the cards point to it. See for yourself. The Sun and Strength Arcana speak of it. Betty looked at the spread cards, the meanings of which didn't tell her anything at all. And if he's alive, then where is he? The woman asked weakly. Yes, he did almost drown but managed to get to shore, Janet continued. Death has already touched him with its shadow but didn't hold on to him. And the Moon Arcanum speaks of illusion, a tangled reality. He's stuck between the scene, not crossing over to the subtle world, nor returning to ours. How does this manifest in life? His body wanders somewhere, not knowing how to return home. Betty knew. This is exactly what she thought, that Stephen simply couldn't return for some reason. Perhaps he hit his head and actually lost his memory. But his presence here during the session was too tangibly. So what should I do? Betty asked anxiously. A very powerful force is needed. It will draw him home. Then we can perform special rituals to bring his astral body back into his physical body. You just need to bring him to me afterward, Janet said confidently. She spoke with such assurance as if Stephen was already home, and Betty, for some reason, refused to bring him to the clairvoyant. Of course, when Stephen returns, Betty will convince him to do any rituals. Yes, of course, thank you, but I didn't understand. Where do I get this powerful force that will, well, draw Stephen home? Betty asked hopefully. For this, we need to perform a special ritual. Together, we'll form an energy funnel that will pull your husband into it. The cost of this ritual is $800. We can perform it right now if you have the money with you, the clairvoyant replied. Of course. Betty eagerly took out her wallet and counted the bills. Janet instructed her to sit silently, took a photo of Stephen, and placed a thick candle on it, lighting it and waving her hands over the flame while whispering incomprehensible words. After a few minutes, the witch poured hot wax over Stephen's photo and handed it to Betty. You'll keep this at home in a prominent place opposite the window. I'll give you some enchanted candles. Every morning you'll light them next to it and recite a special whisper. Here, take the text. Janet handed Betty a crumpled piece of paper. The funnel is formed, and you mustn't be lazy. You have to feed it with your energy. The more often, the better. And try to always be at home. If you leave the house, the energy center will dissolve. Okay, how many days until this ritual works? The woman asked. Well, a week, maximum of 10 days, and he'll show up, your husband, Janet assured her. And don't forget to bring him to me immediately for the ritual. I'll even take you for free. You've touched my heart. At home, Betty arranged everything as Janet instructed. She decided to light the candle immediately, without waiting for morning. Betty smoothed the wax-coated photo of Stephen and felt a special warmth emanating from it. Now she knew that those who never felt the effects of magic are the ones who don't believe in it. Next to the clairvoyant, she herself experienced an extraordinary calmness and even euphoria, as if Betty had been given a miraculous pain reliever. Janet gave her hope, and that was all Betty had left now. She called her parents saying she felt much better, but she wanted to be alone. Sending an email to her boss, Betty arranged for 10 days off sick leave. Her boss was aware of the situation and let her go without asking too many questions. When Betty called Peter to ask him to come to the investigation committee, she lied, saying she was leaving for an urgent business trip. It was evening. Rain tapped on the windows, steadily gaining pace, hinting at the approaching autumn. Betty neatly arranged photos of Stephen on the table, placing candles nearby. Then she took out the wedding photo album and removed her wedding ring, placing it next to them. Janet didn't give such recommendations, but Betty intuitively felt it was necessary. This way, she would strengthen the energy funnel. Now the table resembled more of an altar, and the woman spent most of the day near it, reading incantations and uttering her own sincere prayers, which came from Betty's heart. The next day, during the ritual, Betty heard a faint tap on the window pane. She drew back the curtain and was astonished. There on the windowsill sat a pigeon, tapping on the glass with its beak. It was the same pigeon they had recently rescued together with Stephen. Several months ago, they were walking in the park and noticed the unusual colored bird, white with pale gray wings, such a rare sight. The bird was lying near a tree with its legs broken. They didn't immediately understand whether it was alive or not. Betty approached the bird, gently nudged it, and the pigeon opened its eyes. "Stephen, we have to help him, please," she pleaded, clasping her hands in a beseeching gesture. Her ex-husband would have just laughed. Saving a half-dead street bird, what nonsense. However, Stephen reacted differently. "Let's try, Betty. He's a beautiful fellow, rare. We should show him to the vets." Betty hurried home for a towel. They wrapped the bird in it and drove to the clinic together. Strangely, the doctor wasn't surprised by such a patient. Stephen paid the bill for the treatment, and a few days later, they received a call from the clinic saying that the pigeon was completely healthy. Betty and Stephen retrieved it, brought it to the park, and set it free. "Fly, beauty, live long," the man said with a smile. And now this pigeon had flown to Betty. Undoubtedly, it was him. It was impossible to mistake the bird because of its unusual coloring. The woman ran to the kitchen for some grains, opened the window, and trembling hands poured a handful of grains in front of the pigeon, which immediately began pecking at them. "Eat. Eat, my good boy," she said, fearing to scare the bird. "You've come to me with good news, haven't you? You probably know exactly where my Stephen is. If you see him from above, try to show him the way home. Please." It was an unequivocal sign. Such coincidences just don't happen. The universe was sending Betty a signal, indicating that the rituals were working. Meanwhile, a week had passed. Betty's parents were seriously concerned about their daughter's condition. Her desire to be alone had dragged on too long. Since Betty was hardly in touch, they decided to send their younger daughter to recon. Shirley bought fruits and pastries for her sister and barged into Betty's house with an unexpected visit, saying she was just passing by. Betty reluctantly let her sister in. Shirley immediately noticed that Betty was in a strange, unnaturally elevated mood. She knew that Betty never drank alcohol at all, but in a state of stress, anything was possible. So Shirley decided to check her theory. As if casually, she walked through the rooms, then peeked into the kitchen and opened the fridge, pretending she wanted to put the pastries there. The house was clean. And not only were there no traces of alcohol, but also no fresh food. "Do you eat anything at all, sis?" Shirley asked, concerned. "The fridge is empty, and you've lost a lot of weight." "Well, I have no appetite, you know." Betty tried to justify herself. "I sometimes buy pastries, yogurts, but nothing else appeals to me." Shirley looked at her sister skeptically and followed her into the living room. "Betty, what's this?" Shirley recoiled in horror from the makeshift altar she found in the room. "Don't touch!" the older sister shouted, rushing to the table and covering it with a blanket. "Betty, you're scaring me," Shirley murmured. "All this looks so creepy. Are you like starting to do magic or something?" "Shirley, please don't interfere," Betty replied irritably. "I haven't started anything. I'm just getting help from a powerful hereditary clairvoyant." "And where did you find her?" "Well, look." Betty opened the website and held her phone screen up to her sister's face. "If you don't believe me, Shirley, it's your business. Read how many good reviews there are, huh? She heals people and casts spells, and she said Stephen is alive. He probably lost his memory and can't find his way home. I felt he was near during the session. Janet told me that in our case, a whole complex of rituals is necessary to show him the way. The way home. Shirley refused to believe that her educated, smart sister had fallen for all this nonsense. After all, Betty had always been the most level-headed person, capable of setting anyone on the path of truth. And now what? Shirley looked at her, seeing a woman driven mad by sorrow, emaciated with swollen eyes, clearly in need of help. Otherwise, the scammers wouldn't give up. "So, is this clairvoyant helping you for money, Betty?" Shirley cautiously asked, though she already knew the answer. "Well, of course, who's going to do anything for free these days?" Betty exclaimed. "So, how much did you give her?" "What's it to you, Shirley? These are my hard-earned money. I don't spare anything to bring Stephen back. I'm alone in this huge house. The car is in the garage. What do I need it for? I can't even drive. And I can't even get into it because everything inside smells of him, you understand? I'm not saying you shouldn't spend money. It's not about that. I just don't want you, Betty, to become a victim of scammers who not only take your money but also drain your soul. Most likely your clairvoyant is a fraudster, understand? And all these reviews on the internet, well, goodness, Betty, can you really trust them, huh? They can be ordered." Betty looked offended at Shirley. "You haven't even seen her to claim such a thing." "Listen, sis, people like that good psychologist, they tell clients what they want to hear themselves," Shirley persisted. "They capitalize on others' grief, hooking people. Understand, Betty?" "You know what, dear?" the older sister interrupted. "Leave. I don't need your lectures. You don't know anything about life. You can't even imagine what real sorrow is, Shirley. So, just leave." Shocked, Shirley gasped for air for a few seconds, like a fish thrown onto the shore. Then, grabbing her bag, she dashed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Later on, Betty's mom called, trying to calmly persuade her to make up with her sister. Then she cautiously asked about the clairvoyant, neither condemning nor trying to obstruct. More than 2 weeks had passed since the ritual performed by the witch. All deadlines had passed, but Stephen still hadn't appeared. Betty decided to call Janet. Dialing the number, she heard only, "The subscriber is unavailable or out of the network coverage area." Betty quickly gathered herself and drove to the address where the hereditary clairvoyant had received her. The door was opened by a stocky bald man in dirty jeans with his thin torso exposed, wearing plaid slippers. "Who are you looking for?" the stranger inquired. "Excuse me, can I see Janet?" Betty asked quietly, taken aback by the unexpectedness. "What Janet?" The man frowned. "Well, Janet, the fortune teller is supposed to live here," Betty replied, beginning to understand. "Miss, this apartment is rented out by the day," grinned the bald man, winking at her. "There's no Janet here." Betty stepped back and quickly ran down the stairs. The journey home was far, but she walked, paying no attention to the drizzling rain and chilly wind. She didn't remember how she ended up back home. Barely opening the door, Betty collapsed onto the bed fully clothed. In this state, hours later, she was found by her father, Rick. Betty was feverish and delirious, talking about Stephen, who supposedly was with them right now, in the same room. She spoke about the energy funnel and parallel worlds. It was in this condition that Rick took his daughter to the psychiatric hospital. The doctor's diagnosis was bleak, but specialists gave good forecasts provided the entire treatment cycle was followed. Betty's parents visited their daughter in the hospital every day. It seemed pointless because for over 2 weeks they encountered the same scene. Their daughter, Betty, lay in bed staring blankly at the ceiling. Her mother sat by her side for a long time holding her hand, trying to engage her in conversation. She told Betty about the antics of her beloved pet, reminiscing about funny childhood stories. And if before, their daughter would have laughed, listened intently, and asked questions, now Jessica spoke as if into thin air, into a deaf, bottomless void into which her eldest daughter was immersed. Her kind, intelligent, beautiful daughter. By passport, she was nearly 40, but for her mother, she remained a child, a vulnerable little girl who always lived conscientiously, achieved much in her work, but somehow still hadn't found her feminine happiness. Because it seemed like Stephen was the one destined for her. But their happiness seemed to be envied. Everything fell apart in a moment. Yes, officially their son-in-law was still not considered dead, but could they hope that he was alive? Jessica realized that if Stephen were found and buried, painful as it might be, Betty would perceive this grief differently. Time itself would heal her, but for now she was in a state of anticipation, despite all the facts pointing to a tragic outcome. Her turning to the fraudulent fortune-teller, these incomprehensible visions Betty spoke of, were also a consequence of uncertainty. The brain clung to the tiniest details, speculated, conjured up quite realistic images. Betty seemed to be holding on to her husband in this reality, unable to part with him. Today, the parents decided once again to talk to Terry, Betty's attending physician. They felt her condition was worsening with each passing day. They waited for Terry outside the ward and almost simultaneously began to ask questions about their daughter. I've already told you there's no negative dynamics with Betty. Consequently, there's no positive one either. The patient is stable, Terry replied, frowning. But how can she be stable? Jessica pleaded. She's so pale she used to at least try to smile, but now she's like a mummy, doctor. Stop scrutinizing her so much and stop making it worse, Terry replied, frowning. She's undergoing therapy according to the treatment plan. In her situation, rapid results shouldn't be expected. We'll observe her for at least 3 weeks and adjust the medications. With that said, the doctor went to attend to other patients without even saying goodbye. Yeah, those doctors, Rick sighed. Can't really say anything concrete. Let's sit down, please, his wife asked in a strained voice. I think I'm getting high blood pressure. Shall we go buy something to drink? Jessica inserted coins into the coffee vending machine with trembling fingers. Rick, I don't understand how to press it. The woman looked at her husband bewilderedly. I don't understand anything about these machines myself, Rick grumbled, frowning. Why did you even bother? We could have gone home and you could have had your tea there. I need to take a pill. Sit down, calm down, the woman justified herself. Here it seems you have to press the button for tea. Now what? When will it start pouring? A passing doctor stopped next to them and confidently pressed the button. An empty cup immediately appeared in the machine's window, and hot liquid poured inside. Oh, thank you, Jessica said gratefully. So, you're Betty's parents from room 28? Yes, the woman nodded, surprised. How did you know? Well, I've been seeing you here for several days now. I overheard your conversation with Dr. Terry just now, the doctor replied. Don't take his words too close to heart. He's a good specialist, just has his own way of communicating, plus he's very busy. My wife and I are just at a loss, Rick interjected. We just want to cure our daughter as soon as possible. If her treating doctor has this attitude, I doubt she'll get better here. No, I'm telling you, you're mistaken, the doctor insisted. The best specialists in the city work here. Just be patient, and your daughter will feel better, I promise. Then you can take her home or send her for further rehabilitation. We've been told it's better to send her to a rehab center than home. Everything here just reminds her of the tragedy, Jessica replied sorrowfully. But where to send her for further rehabilitation, I just can't figure out. Yes, I understand, the doctor nodded. If you want, I can recommend a good place. It's affordable because it's away from all the tourist spots. And they really get people back on their feet there. Really? Oh, please, could you give us the contacts? Jessica rejoiced. We were just looking for recommendations to ensure our daughter gets the help she needs. All right, take down this number. Call and say it's from Steve Cooper. I think I can find a spot for you faster that way. The doctor quickly wrote down the numbers on a piece of paper and handed them to Jessica. Well, I better get going, wishing you good luck. Get well soon. Thank you so much, the woman shouted to the swiftly retreating doctor at the other end of the hallway. Betty's attending physician, along with the young doctor Steve Cooper, turned out to be right. Within a couple of weeks, Betty began to noticeably improve. She still remained withdrawn and showed almost no emotions. But she started talking to her parents. Now she listened to her mom's stories with a slight interest, asked some questions, and occasionally smiled. She was especially happy about Shirley's visits, immediately apologizing to her sister. Terry continued to hurriedly answer Betty's parents' questions on the go. As for Steve Cooper, they only saw him in the ward once. He waved to them in the corridor as a greeting and didn't even come closer, hurrying about his business. However, this was no longer important. Their eldest daughter was getting better, and there was no longer such a need to hassle the medical staff. But it was still too early to rejoice. Despite the obvious positive trend towards Betty's full recovery, it was too early to say. It seemed like she was making an effort not to reveal her true state. As expected, Betty responded indifferently to the idea of going to the rehabilitation center in the mountains, just like any other attempt to help her. She didn't demonstrate a desire to go there, but she didn't resist much either. She simply didn't care. Jessica tried to hold on with all her might. She didn't want to show her daughter her emotions, although it was extremely difficult. Seeing her bright-eyed Betty replaced by someone devoid of any interest in life was unbearably hard. The woman would give anything to take at least some of her daughter's pain upon herself, to help Betty endure such an unbearable burden. But it was impossible. No words of encouragement, no persuasions, no attempts to bring her back to her former self yielded noticeable results. After being discharged, Betty was brought back to her parents' home. Shirley didn't leave her sister's side for a moment, pretending she was on vacation, although she actually took time off work. The family didn't want to leave Betty alone, and that was the right decision. Alone, the woman instantly fell into despair. The doctors were right. Betty needed comprehensive treatment. The Mountain Fairy Tale Rehabilitation Center was the perfect place for that. Jessica was glad she managed to secure a spot for her daughter. Apparently, Betty didn't want to upset her mother, noticing how hard she was trying for her, so after a few days she agreed to go there, and even smiled when she saw the relief on her mother's face. Together with her father, they packed Betty's things and escorted her to the bus. It was very convenient. The bus departed from the station in the evening, so they could nap on the way, and by morning, the bus would arrive at its destination. Betty settled into the window seat, placing a blanket she had brought under her head, hoping to fall asleep quickly. Sleep had been her main salvation in recent weeks. Only in her dreams could Betty avoid the cruel reality where Stephen was absent. And sometimes he appeared in her dreams, handsome and smiling, and Betty always woke up with a warm flutter in her heart. A tall man of approximately her age politely settled next to her, nodding. As soon as the bus started moving, he put on his headphones, turned on the music, and closed his eyes, reclining the seat back. He sat too close so Betty could smell his sharp cologne and the music playing in his headphones. Rough, annoying, with a jagged rhythm. Irritation grew with each passing second. Betty tried to move away from her neighbor, but the bus seats were too narrow and there was nowhere else for her to sit. She tried to distract herself and fall asleep, but it was of no use. Everything irritated her. The uncomfortable bus, the trip itself, the silly music, and her own senseless, shattered life. "Could you please lower the volume?" Betty finally couldn't stand it and addressed the stranger. "Pardon?" he asked, shifting his headphones to the side. "The thing is, your music is playing very loudly and I can't fall asleep," she answered irritably. "How do you not go deaf with those headphones?" The man looked at her intently, but instead of replying in the same sharp tone, he suddenly smiled at Betty. "Maybe it's the music itself. How about I play something you like and the problem's solved?" the man unexpectedly suggested. Betty was taken aback by his reaction. "I'm not really in the mood for music right now, I just want some quiet," she snapped and turned away. "Well, sometimes silence can be too loud. It's better to replace it with other sounds," her neighbor replied softly. "All right then, Frank Sinatra, my way," Betty said. "Great choice," the man smiled and without much surprise started scrolling through his smartphone playlist. Iria glanced at him with curiosity. What a coincidence. She named one of the few classical pieces she knew, and it turned out to be in the playlist of a stranger on the bus. "There we go," he exclaimed, finding the right track. The man pressed play and handed Betty the right earbud, ignoring her suspicious look. Betty had no choice but to start listening to the piece from her personal playlist. The music was magical. It soothed, enchanted, and carried her away to mysterious realms where earthly sufferings had no place. For the first time in over 2 months, tranquility replaced emptiness. The random fellow traveler was right, letting beautiful sounds into the dead silence of her heart. The man didn't stop the player, and she kept listening more and more, sinking into the comforting embrace of sleep. Betty woke up to the glare of headlights shining directly into her eyes from somewhere outside. The bus had arrived at a technical stop, which was scheduled along the route. Several cars and tourist buses were parked in the lot, with some people bustling around them. The bus driver announced a 20-minute stop. Everything here was arranged for tourists. There was a 24-hour cafe with hot food, toilets, and a small shop with everything necessary for the journey, from drinks to hygiene products. Betty didn't feel like eating, but she decided to get out to stretch her legs a bit and buy some tea. The cafe was bustling with people. Betty asked for a cup of tea and grabbed a chocolate bar from the display, wondering when her appetite would return at all. Approaching the counter, she reached into her purse for her wallet and froze. It wasn't there. Placing the tea on the counter, she frantically searched through her bag's contents when she heard loud voices nearby. At the entrance stood her fellow traveler, holding tightly onto a short, bald-headed guy in a tracksuit who was desperately trying to break free. In his hands was a bright red wallet. It was the one Betty was currently searching for in her bag. "Hey man, are you out of your mind? Let me go," the guy yelled. "Where are you rushing off to, huh?" the man demanded menacingly. "We'll call the police and they'll deal with you." "Dude, I'm telling you, I found this wallet. Oh, if it's yours, take it and leave me alone, please," the guy pleaded. With these words, the guy jerked sharply to the side. Breaking free from the grip of Betty's fellow traveler, he dashed away. It all happened so quickly that Betty barely managed to take a few steps towards them. The man smiled and handed her back the stolen item. "Oh, thank you so much," she thanked him. "Did I really drop it?" "No, this guy pulled it out of your bag while you were standing in line. These kinds of things happen all the time," he explained. "I don't even know how to thank you," Betty said, flustered. "There isn't much cash in there, but there are a few bank cards that would need to be blocked, which is more complicated. And there's also a photo that's valuable to me, so thank you again. What's your name, by the way?" "I'm Adam," the man replied with a smile. "We should call the police. These guys don't get far from the scene of the crime, but I doubt those who are traveling with us would agree to wait and deal with it." "Yeah, you're right," Betty nodded. "Especially since the chances of catching this thief right now are very slim. By the way, my name is Betty, and once again, thank you, Adam. Thank you for your help." She returned to get her tea paid and sat down on the bus, which was already ready to depart. Adam acted as if nothing had happened. He only asked why Betty was traveling to the rehabilitation center alone. However, she didn't elaborate on the true reasons for her trip, just saying that she was very tired and therefore chose such a secluded vacation. As it turned out, Adam had worked for many years in a large electrical engineering company, and the annual trip to the rehabilitation center was part of his benefits package. Betty also wanted to ask why he was traveling alone, but suddenly felt that her communication resource had dried up. Despite the fact that her random travel companion turned out to be a good conversationalist, Betty once again wanted to close her eyes and rest a bit. She had always found it difficult to engage in conversations with strangers, sincerely admiring those who could easily strike up a casual conversation with the first person they met in line, at the clinic, or on public transport. Betty had difficulty making contact, opening up only to close acquaintances. At the same time, she couldn't help but notice that her conversation with Adam started quite easily, but it was due to the unpleasant incident in the cafe, so she kept the conversation going. And she did it only out of politeness. Adam himself wasn't interesting to her. Right now, she wasn't interested in anything at all. She politely smiled at him and closed her eyes. Several hours later, the bus arrived at the rehabilitation center. Betty knew that the places in these parts were famous for their beauty throughout the country, but she didn't even suspect that it would be so beautiful. At the hotel, Betty was accommodated in a small but cozy room, from the window of which there was a breathtaking view of the mountains. Patrick, the administrator who was checking Betty in, recommended going out onto the balcony at sunset. "It's an incomparable pleasure," he advised her. "And now you'll need to go see the treating doctor for your treatment plan. For some, this is just a hotel, but for those who need to improve their health, it's a full-fledged rehabilitation center." Betty suddenly found herself thinking that she actually liked it here. It was a beautiful place, with friendly administrators and other staff who smiled and greeted her as they crossed paths in the corridors. She immediately called her parents, thanking them for sending her to this mountain fairy tale. In her mother's voice, she heard notes of relief, and Betty promised not to upset her parents with her mental state anymore. After the call, she visited the doctor. Upon learning that her day would be filled with various procedures and IV drips, after which she would feel like a different person, Betty returned to her room and finally fell asleep. She slept peacefully and deeply, waking up only in the evening. Checking the time, she realized she still had time for dinner. In the restaurant, Betty met Adam, who offered to keep her company. She ate very little, but even that was an achievement for her. Adam, on the other hand, enjoyed his dinner with obvious pleasure. She looked at him and thought he was nothing like Stephen, simple and open, somewhat boring even, unlike her husband, bright, talented, noble. No one could compare to her Stephen. And Adam? Well, just chatting during the vacation, why not? After dinner, they decided to take a stroll. The mountain fairy tale was built in the last century, and over time, the building housed both a rehabilitation center, a hotel, and even the headquarters of some political party. Then it was bought by businessman Walter Hamilton, who created an excellent place with quality treatment and wonderful living conditions. The hotel owner himself lived here permanently. In his spare time, he loved personally talking to guests, getting their feedback on his creation. For 2 days, Betty tried to attend all the procedures, sleep a lot, eat well, and not think about anything. She needed to restore her health, and only then she would decide how to continue her search for Stephen. In the evenings, she walked with Adam. Betty gradually told him her story. No, she wasn't afraid of shocking her new acquaintance with anything. The memories hurt her. That was the difficulty. Betty briefly talked about her life with her husband in a neutral tone, without going into details or emotions. And she warned him about the situation with his disappearance immediately. Talking about it was very difficult for her. Adam listened to the fellow traveler's story with understanding, although it was noticeable that he was considering everything she said and clearly wanted to ask clarifying questions. He refrained from doing so out of respect for his new acquaintance. Adam himself was divorced. His ex-wife remarried and moved to another city with their son, whom the man missed terribly. He didn't get to see the child often. Adam hinted that he would like to find a new life partner. He even admitted that theoretically Betty would be very suitable for this role, but as soon as he met her reproachful gaze, he understood immediately. Such a conversation was not appropriate at the moment. With Adam, she felt very comfortable. In many ways, they were similar. With him, she could be herself. She even regretted not meeting him under different circumstances. Perhaps if her heart were open to love, then why think about it? After all, she was married now, and for her, Stephen was still alive. One day they settled by the pool. It was a bit chilly to swim, but sunbathing was just fine. There were 2 free loungers by the pool, which Betty and Adam took. On the adjacent lounger lay an elderly woman, whom one wouldn't dare call a grandmother. Stylish swimsuit, bright manicure, dark sunglasses covering half of her face, and a wide-brimmed hat. This woman was worth admiring. And Betty did so discreetly. Only deep wrinkles betrayed her age. The lady was clearly over 70, if not more. She held a glass of wine in her hands, displaying complete satisfaction with life. I wish I looked like her at her age, thought Betty, realizing that she had let herself go a bit, while the stranger was slender and graceful. I should at least start running in the mornings. The doctor said it's beneficial, even for my psychological state. How I long to return to everything that was. My peaceful family life, my beloved job, and our runs in the park, she mused sadly. Young man, could you tilt my umbrella a bit? The lady asked loudly, addressing Adam. Nowadays, everyone writes about the harm of tanning, so I decided to protect myself from the sun. I don't need to die prematurely. Oh yes, of course, gladly. Adam smiled, stood up and began adjusting the umbrella so that the lady's lounger was in the shade. There, all set. Oh, thank you. Here's to your health, the woman said, taking a few sips from her glass. Would you like to join with your wife? No, thank you. Betty peeked out from behind Adam and smiled at the woman. And we're not spouses. Well, that's how it seems to you, but I know better, the woman insisted. As for me, I might not refuse, Adam said to the elderly woman, extending his hand to her and politely bowing his head. I'm Dennis, the lady proudly proclaimed. "So, Dennis, you claim that Betty and I look like a married couple, huh?" Adam asked. "You should listen to my words, Adam," the woman replied languidly. "In 87 years of my life, I've never been wrong about such things." 87? Seriously? Adam exclaimed sincerely. "Oh, don't flatter me," the lady chuckled. "I look my age and I don't hide it at all. It's just that everyone else my age looks much worse, especially those who are already in the ground." "You also have a great sense of humor," Adam laughed. "Yes, humor is what allows me to live for so long." "Yes, looking at you, one realizes that there's still a lot of excitement ahead. It gives strength and helps to move forward," Adam concluded. "Of course. You're still a young boy. You're definitely not over 40, right?" Dennis smiled. "Even I still have so many plans for the future. I buried 3 husbands. Met the 4th, younger than me. I hope at least this one won't die before me. I've been doing ballroom dancing all my life. Now it's not so easy to find a partner. So, I'm trying to convince Greg to go dancing with me." Betty cracked open her eyes and glanced at the lady. Dennis indeed looked younger. She was slim and toned, as much as possible at such an advanced age. However, the mention of a young husband somewhat unsettled Betty. She pictured a bronzed, muscular hunk who, for some reason, married this grandmother. At least, that's how such unions look in movies. "Oh, here's my dear Greg coming from his treatments. Let me introduce you." Dennis waved her hand towards the entrance. From there, an elderly man in a white linen suit and carrying a woven basket approached. "Oh, so this is your husband," Adam exclaimed. "Yes, he's only 72. I told you I found myself a young one. Look how briskly he's walking, and he's even bringing me some berries." Dennis chuckled. Now Adam engaged in a similar conversation with Dennis's young 72-year-old husband. Betty no longer listened to their chatter. They bonded over chess and agreed to play a couple of games in the coming days. It was amazing. It's as if Adam had a key to everyone he started talking to. At that moment, Betty truly realized how immersed she was in her own worries. She had completely stopped noticing what was happening around her. Who were the new interesting people appearing? During breakfast, Betty and Adam crossed paths with Dennis again, as well as her husband Greg, who were sitting at adjacent tables. It was delightful to watch this elderly couple. Their age difference was completely imperceptible because Dennis was in constant motion, full of vitality, making her look 20 years younger. That morning, she appeared in a long silk dress with red poppies, and on her head, she wore a matching turban. The elderly woman looked as if she had stepped out of the pages of a glossy magazine, and no one paid attention to her wrinkles anymore. This lady looked so striking. They chirped pleasantly about something and occasionally laughed. Surely Dennis had experienced many sorrows in life. Take the deaths of her husbands, for example. Now she speaks of it with a touch of sarcasm, but back then she surely experienced such events as tragedies. She didn't stop, didn't fall apart, she pulled herself together and moved on. And not just moved on, but danced. Will I be able to dance at 90? Betty wondered to herself. Will I be able to move at all at that age, and will I even be alive? A big question, considering how recent events have weakened me. Betty realized that even these chance encounters were sent to her as a gentle reprimand. It was as if to say, you can't fall into despair and give up. Look, life goes on. Of course, it wasn't possible to stop suffering with just a snap of the fingers. This shock was too strong and unexpected. Stephen was gone when their happiness was at its peak. But why did fate give them so little time? Betty, do you know when they have discos here? Dennis interrupted her thoughts. I finally persuaded my husband to accompany me in a slow waltz. Oh, if I'm not mistaken, musical evenings are held on Saturdays, Betty replied. And if they're not held, I think they should be organized solely for your couple, Adam added. You're charming, Adam, and both of you simply a charming couple, Dennis said with a dazzling smile. Yes, thank you, and your zest for life is truly admirable, Betty sincerely admitted. Well, the zest for life is what makes it worth living, to enjoy and rejoice, not to suffer, the woman said. Especially since every day could be the last, Betty, even here, in this paradise. Well, I hope our days here won't be our last, Adam smirked. I have some plans for the next 20 years, and we came here to help our bodies stay healthy to fulfill those plans, right? Well, are you aware that this place has its secrets? Suddenly said Dennis with an impassive expression. What do you mean? What does that mean? Betty frowned. It means that people disappear, and in the most mysterious way. Okay, if there was a body of water nearby where they could drown. But the river is more than a kilometer down the mountain, and people disappear right from here, from the mountain ferry. A little girl disappeared last year, then a woman, and a young guy too. Literally, there's a person here today and tomorrow he's gone. Like in a science fiction movie, the woman pronounced dramatically, watching the reactions of her companions. Betty immediately felt a piercing pain in her heart. Hearing this was unbearable, and about the body of water where you could drown, and about the disappearances. Now, hold on a second. People can't just disappear like that, Adam objected. If there were such cases, they would surely be reported everywhere, and the hotel itself could be closed. They try to keep it quiet. Nobody needs a fuss. And all because the owner of the hotel, Walter Hamilton, his wife also disappeared. Have you seen him? How sad he looks. And that happened just last year, Dennis shared with the others. So you knew about this, but still came to such a dangerous place, is that right? Betty was surprised. What do I have to fear? I haven't been afraid of anything for a long time. I live every day as if it were my last. But suppose they steal me, so what? The woman laughed. And I won't let anyone steal you, Dennis, Greg spoke up, who until then had simply been listening attentively to the conversation. You're my knight, Dennis exclaimed, and sent her husband an air kiss across the table. After the procedures, Betty decided to sit on the balcony. At this hour, there was a special silence in the rehabilitation center, not disturbed by the sounds of evening concerts or neighbors' conversations. Betty settled into a comfortable chair and closed her eyes, basking in the warm rays of the sun. It was such a gentle and particularly precious moment during the inexorably approaching autumn. Betty, Betty, suddenly she heard a whisper, sounding very close. What? Betty instinctively replied. I'm already dead, and you're still here. I'm waiting for you. The voice sounded more distinct and more terrifying, as if someone was whispering these words directly into her ear. Betty couldn't move from the horror that gripped her. It seemed to her that the sound was coming from above. Finally, she found the strength within herself and slowly raised her head. No one. I'm dead, and I'll take you with me. The whisper was fading away, turning into a rustling, barely distinguishable sound, resembling the rustle of the wind. It wasn't just creepy. It indicated that the state in which Betty ended up in the hospital was returning. Again, voices and visions, strange coincidences and signs. It was hard to tell if all this was really happening or if it was just a product of her imagination. Suddenly, Betty had a thought. What if someone was playing a prank on her, or conducting some kind of experiment, taking advantage of her condition? Yes, there's Adam, for example. Why is he always around her? After taking a few deep breaths and eagerly drinking a glass of water, the woman went downstairs. In the spacious lobby, where there were tables for table tennis and several sofas, there weren't so many people. Almost immediately, Betty noticed Adam. He was sitting at a small table playing chess with Greg. It turns out it wasn't Adam, who had just whispered to her from above, although it wouldn't hurt to make sure for sure. Noticing her, Greg waved friendly to Betty. Here, Betty, it's 1-1, the man proclaimed. Apparently, Dennis had convinced her husband that Betty and Adam were a couple, and it was pointless to argue. How long have you been playing? Betty asked, trying to maintain a casual demeanor. We've been sitting for an hour already, Adam replied. Greg turned out to be a strong opponent. Greg clearly was pleased with the compliment and focused on the board, hiding his satisfied smile. In the evening, Betty was afraid to fall asleep. She lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds around her, afraid to hear that whisper. She didn't want to tell anyone about this incident, not even the doctor. The more time passed, the more it seemed to her that the whisper was in her head. Nightmares haunted her, and Betty woke up several times in a cold sweat. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness was so fragile that she no longer understood if all these horrors were real. She prayed for one thing only, for morning to come soon. You look tired, Adam noticed over breakfast, studying his friend. Didn't you sleep well, Betty? I had strange dreams all night. I think I'll ask the doctor to prescribe some sleeping pills or something sedative. I'm scared to return to the state I was in not long ago, Betty confessed to Adam. Well, maybe we'll do without drugs for now, eh? The man suggested. Let's go for a horse ride after the procedure today. It's very popular here. Betty gladly agreed. Since her arrival, she hadn't left the Mountain Tail territory, although the surroundings were simply stunning. They reached the place where horses were rented out. The young stableman put them on almost identical chestnut horses and said he would go ahead on his horse to show them the most picturesque route. Betty was so grateful to Adam for this ride. She had only ridden a horse in her childhood. How much she had missed, and what views opened up around them. She wanted to enjoy it. Enjoy every moment, absorb the healing beauty with every fiber of her being. When they were deep in the forest, Betty suddenly heard music. At first, she could barely make out the sounds, and when she realized what melody it was, she almost lost consciousness. It was their favorite composition with Stephen, and it wasn't available to the public. Someone from the local musicians had recorded it for them. This melody played at their wedding during their first dance. Then they often played it at home. And most importantly, this melody couldn't sound anywhere else, let alone here in the forest. There could be no doubt. Something strange was happening to Betty again. Isn't it curious? It's quite a remote place, yet music is playing from somewhere, Adam exclaimed, catching up with Betty. Are you saying, Adam, you hear it too? The woman exclaimed. Well, of course it sounds quite loud, and why are you so pale, Betty? He asked, looking at her with concern. Phew, thank goodness, she sighed. Adam, I thought it was just in my head. Are you serious? I can see that something's been off with you for the past couple of days, Adam said sympathetically. To be honest, yes, she nodded. Nightmares, voices, and now this melody. It's reassuring that at least you hear it too. This composition was connected to me and Stephen. It's strange, of course, but it's probably a coincidence. Adam looked pensive. If you hear any voices again or see anything unusual, you tell me immediately, okay? Betty nodded silently, hoping she wouldn't have to turn to Adam for help. They returned to the hotel when it was already dark. In the lobby, Betty and Adam met Dennis again, who was lively discussing the upcoming dance night with the staff. And here's our sweet couple, she sang out, seeing Betty and Adam. And our dear Patrick is just briefing me on the details of the upcoming disco, and you two simply must be there. Betty and Adam, the sweet couple, didn't object to such an address anymore. But as for the dance, it was worth serious consideration. Betty entered her room, reflecting on how much she could learn from this amazing woman. And it wasn't about her ability to dress up and keep herself in shape, no. Not being afraid of anything, living each day as if it were the last. Dennis's attitude had a profound meaning. You stop dwelling on suffering and start enjoying life. But how to come to that when there are gaping wounds in the soul that still bleed? Betty turned on the light in the room and froze. On the table stood a portrait of Stephen, with a black mourning ribbon stretched across the lower corner. Covering her mouth with her hand, barely holding back a scream, she rushed out into the corridor and almost knocked over Patrick, who was passing by with several boxes in his hands. Help, help, I beg you, she cried, grabbing him by the sleeve. What happened? The administrator asked anxiously, placing the boxes on the carpet. I have a portrait of my husband in my room, a husband who didn't die but disappeared. Or died, although I don't know, Betty explained incoherently. But this portrait is in mourning, understand? Someone brought it while I was out of the room. Wow! Betty, calm down, please, we'll figure it out right away, Patrick reassured her. Confidently, he entered the room and called Betty after a minute. Overcoming her own fear, Betty entered the room, trying not to look at the table. So where you say was this portrait? Well, with your husband? The guy asked, puzzled. The woman was dumbfounded. The portrait on the table was gone. She looked around, checked under the table, and even lifted the carpet. Nothing. How is this possible? She muttered. He was just standing here on the table. Is this some kind of cruel prank, huh? Well, as you can see, Betty, there's nothing, Patrick concluded. If you claim someone came to your room, let's go downstairs and check the security cameras. They went down to the reception. Patrick turned the computer screen to her and pressed a few buttons. The monitor displayed an image of the corridor where Betty's room was located. So, roughly what time did you leave the room? The hotel staff member asked. Well, around 3, Betty replied after a brief pause. Okay, let's rewind then, he said, focusing as he scrolled through the footage. Here, look, you're leaving. Now let's fast forward and see people. There aren't many of them here. Betty focused on the screen. Nothing happened in the corridor. Occasionally, people appeared in the frame, and then Patrick slowed down the video to get a better look at them. But they all just passed by. Finally, they reached the frames where Betty returned to the room and then rushed out, bumping into Patrick walking down the corridor. Well, there you go, the administrator shrugged. No one came to you, Betty. Maybe they came in through the balcony, the woman suggested. No, that's impossible. Patrick shook his head. Climbing in from the street is not inconspicuous. Besides, your balcony door was locked from the inside. And there are cameras outside too. Let's check those. No, it's not necessary. Betty stopped him with a gesture. Thank you for your help, Patrick. I don't know how this happened. Maybe I just imagined it. Thanking Patrick once again, she went back upstairs. It was scary to return to her room. Betty went up one floor and knocked on Adam's door. He didn't open immediately, looking quite sleepy, but after rubbing his eyes, he smiled. I'm dreaming and dreaming. This definitely isn't a nightmare. Adam, I'm not in the mood for jokes. Sorry, can I come in? Betty said, sounding worried. Of course, come in. His face instantly took on a concerned look. Betty sat down in the armchair and told her friend about what had happened. The man listened silently and, scratching his head, cautiously spoke. Listen, Betty, don't take offense. Well, you understand that we dismiss mysticism right away. So I also lean towards the idea that you imagined it. And considering what you told me, well, during the day, I think you should still talk to your treating doctor. Wait, but how could I have imagined all this? It wasn't whispers from above, not a hallucination. It was a real thing on the table. And if I hadn't been so scared, I would have even touched it. Betty defended herself. Then there must be some logical explanation, Adam insisted. And you said you checked the cameras, right? So, if no one entered the room in your absence, then there was no way for the photographs to be there, Betty. Understand? It's so scary, Adam, the woman said with a trembling voice. I want to leave here. Although it'll be worse for me at home. They say you can't run away from yourself. Yeah, and that's a very accurate saying. You'll still make it home, but at least here you're under treatment, don't forget. With these words, Adam unexpectedly hugged her. Okay, I'll talk to the doctor tomorrow, Betty promised and hugged him tighter. Well, do you want to stay over? Adam suggested. There was only one bed in the room, but the man gave the guest a separate blanket and his own t-shirt. Strangely enough, there was no awkwardness or ambiguity. They didn't even talk. The man understood that his friend needed peace and a sense of security. Betty lay in the dark next to Adam and tried to understand by his breathing if he was sleeping or not. Most likely, yes, because he breathed quietly and evenly. It was reassuring. Betty knew for sure that there couldn't possibly be any monsters, voices, or visions next to him. Adam turned from one side to the other, and his hand accidentally landed on her shoulder. Betty wanted to move away, but then changed her mind. The warmth of his hand was very pleasant, and the woman realized how much she missed this gentle touch. Betty woke up early in the morning and realized that she had finally slept. It was already light outside, and returning to her room was not scary. Quietly, so as not to wake Adam, she changed into her clothes and slipped out of his room, carefully closing the door behind her. Betty took a shower, changed clothes, and went downstairs for breakfast. Strangely enough, Adam wasn't there, even though he usually came at the same time. After a few minutes, Greg and Dennis entered the restaurant, and as usual, Dennis asked about Betty's beloved. Betty herself would like to know that. She called him on the phone, but Adam didn't answer. Then she decided to go up to his room. Approaching the door, Betty remembered that she hadn't locked it when she left, and the room remained unlocked. Pushing the door, she was stunned. The room was empty. Neither Adam nor his things were there. The woman quickly went downstairs and walked to the reception desk, where Patrick was sitting and typing something on the computer. "Patrick, good morning. Do you happen to know where Adam Hayes from room 317 is right now?" she asked. "I'm sorry, I just started my shift, but if I'm not mistaken, the guest from 317 checked out a couple of hours ago," Patrick replied. "Wait, what do you mean checked out? That's impossible. He had a reservation until the weekend." Betty's surprise knew no bounds. "Well, I can't know that." Patrick shrugged and looked back at the computer. "Yes, that's correct. It says here that Adam checked out and left." Betty tried calling Adam again, but still heard only long beeps on the other end. She couldn't understand what could have happened. Maybe she was talking in her sleep and said something horrible. Even if her new friend had an urgent reason for such a sudden departure, why wasn't he answering? A sudden beep startled Betty as she held the phone. A message from Adam appeared on the screen. "Betty, stop calling me. I decided to go home. I no longer want to communicate with you." Such a turn of events was the last thing she expected. It was so unexpected that she couldn't hold back and burst into tears. The fragile, almost ephemeral island of safety that had appeared in her life crumbled in an instant, turning to dust. Unfortunately, today the treating doctor was off duty, and Betty most of all wanted to get some strong sedative to sleep and feel nothing. Patrick noticed that she was crying, came out from behind the reception desk, and approached Betty. "Is something wrong? Can I help you with something?" he asked with concern. "I just feel really bad. Really, and there's no doctor," Betty replied softly, looking up at Patrick. "Okay, wait a minute, don't go anywhere," Patrick quickly said and ran off. He returned a few minutes later with a glass of water and a glass bottle of pills. "Here, Betty, take this. It's not medicine, it's our signature herbal infusion. It has valerian, chamomile, and a number of other medicinal plants. I take them periodically when I'm stressed and have a lot of work to do." Betty thanked the administrator, took the infusion, and washed it down with water. "Take it with you, I have more," Patrick smiled at her. "And don't cry anymore. Whatever happens, it will pass." Betty wandered aimlessly around the rehabilitation center all day. She sat on the balcony and gazed into the distance for a long time, and in the evening fell asleep. The herbal infusion indeed worked better than pharmaceuticals. In the morning, she was awakened by a phone call from an unknown number. "Betty, good day," a pleasant male voice came from the receiver. "This is Keith Perkins from the investigation committee. I'm assistant to your investigator, Peter." "Yes, hello," Betty answered anxiously. "Unfortunately, I have bad news for you," the investigator said. "Yesterday, a body of a man was retrieved from the lake. There are all reasons to believe that it belongs to your husband, Stephen." Betty felt as if everything in the room was dissolving and turning into a dirty, sticky mass that sucked her body in, like swamp mud. The same swamp that had taken away her beloved person a few weeks ago, leaving her alone with unbearable longing and pain. To avoid losing consciousness, Betty slid to the floor, clutching the armrests of the chair. "Why? Why did you decide it was Stephen?" she whispered, barely audibly. "Well, according to the data outlined in the report, your husband had a tattoo on his left forearm with the phrase, 'Everything passes,' and a watch nearby. That's what was found on the body," Keith Perkins replied. "But it could be a mistake. Maybe someone else has a similar tattoo. I'll come for identification. It may not be quick, but I'll be here tomorrow or the day after. Just tell me where." "Oh, Betty, I understand your state, but you better calm down and not rush. We'll definitely invite you for identification, but first the body has to be brought here, and that will take at least 5 or 6 days considering all the paperwork," Keith Perkins replied calmly. "Then how did you find out about the tattoo?" the woman shouted through tears. "But based on photographic evidence, of course. I must say the body isn't in the best condition. After all, it spent a long time underwater in a layer of mud. It seems it was dragged into a whirlpool and then into a cave, and he couldn't get out from there. So you need to be prepared for this procedure. It won't be easy," Keith tried to reassure her. After hanging up, Betty collapsed face down on the bed, burying her face in the pillow. She cried out loud. Everything. It was the end. Yes, she knew that Stephen had drowned, but as long as he was listed as missing, Betty hadn't lost hope that her beloved husband was alive. She was ready to believe in any, even the most incredible or even mystical story, and now that very last thread of hope was cut off. Betty called her mother, told her about the tragic news. Jessica was crying too. It couldn't be said that she had had time to love her son-in-law, although she treated him well, seeing how her daughter blossomed with him. Her bitter tears were now for Betty herself, who was barely holding on in recent weeks, and now she would grieve much harder. The room became cramped. The thick air made it hard to breathe. Betty paced around the room, opening all the windows wide, but it didn't get any easier. She wanted to howl with pain, feeling it fill every cell of her being, her entire nature. Then her dad called, then Shirley, but each time it was difficult for her to talk to them. Betty desperately wanted to talk to Adam. Yes, never mind that he rudely brushed her off because at that moment, Adam didn't know what had happened today and what condition she was in. Her inner voice screamed at Betty not to do it, but she silenced it and dialed Adam's number. And again. Again, those long, endless beeps on the line. She understood. He simply wouldn't answer, so she wrote him a message. Adam, I just found out that they found Stephen's body. I feel unbearably bad. Please answer me. I just need to talk to you and I won't bother you anymore. I promise. She pressed send and almost immediately saw the notification that the message was read, and a couple of minutes later, the cherished inscription appeared at the top of the screen. Adam is typing. He's responding to her. She watched those letters with a pounding heart, and finally, a reply came. Leave me alone. You mean absolutely nothing to me. I don't want to hear anything about your deceased husbands. I don't want to hear anything about you either. What did Betty do wrong in her life? Why does fate keep hitting her one blow after another, knocking the woman down, not allowing her to get up or take a breath? There's no strength left to fight, to leave this world. That's what Betty wanted more than anything right now. Betty lay in delirium until deep into the night. Her body burned and was so heavy that she couldn't move. Strange shadows danced on the walls from the light of the street lamps, resembling monsters. Early in the morning, there was a knock on the door. At first, it was cautious, then more insistent. Betty, are you in there? Came a faint female voice from somewhere far away. And here I hear voices again. Everything around me is talking to me, even the walls. Betty thought and closed her eyes. The door was knocked again, and then the sound of the electronic lock opening was heard, and the administrator Helen entered the room. Betty, are you okay? The girl asked anxiously, looking around the room. Everyone was worried about you. Your parents reached out to us and said you haven't been in touch since yesterday, and you missed your appointments yesterday. Betty struggled to reach for the phone and saw dozens of missed calls from her mom, dad, and the attending physician on the screen. I'm sorry, I got sick and fell asleep, Betty apologized to the girl. Yes, I understand, Helen replied, although her face showed disbelief in the guest. But in any case, your dad and sister have come to see you, and they'll be here soon. Betty suddenly realized how important her family's support was to her right now. Hey, it wouldn't have crossed her mind to ask her relatives to come, and thanks to her silence, they came on their own. Just a few hours later, her father and sister entered the room. Betty still couldn't find the strength to wash up, let alone tidy up the scattered belongings in the room. At the moment, she didn't care at all. Sweetie, you scared us so much. Her dad hugged her, and Betty breathed in his scent, so familiar and beloved. Thank God you're okay because we were starting to worry when we couldn't reach the administrator. Her dad continued. Forgive me, Betty whispered weakly. I'm tormenting myself and causing suffering to everyone around me. No one is suffering here, and we won't let you suffer, Shirley replied with a smile. Yes, there are tough days ahead, but you need to gather strength if only for the memory of Stephen. So get up, take a shower, and I'll tidy up here and make you some tea. Betty nodded obediently and headed to the bathroom. Doing what she was told was the best decision right now. After a shower and a cup of tea, she actually felt a little better. At least the scary monsters seemed to have disappeared somewhere, and the fog in her head had cleared. It was decided to leave this place the next morning, despite the fact that their stay here was paid for until the end of the week. Betty's father went to talk to her attending physician while her sister stayed in the room. Betty told Shirley about everything that had happened here over the past few days, about Adam, about her strange visions and voices. Shirley didn't dismiss it as nonsense and didn't say that Betty needed treatment. She listened attentively to her older sister, asking many questions. The episode with Adam outraged Shirley the most in this whole story. It used to seem like Shirley was still very young and didn't understand relationships. In fact, she had long been an adult, a sensible woman. "He's just immature and irresponsible," Shirley concluded. "He didn't want to take responsibility, Betty, and solve your problems, even though he liked you." "Yes, Shirley, did I ask him to solve anything?" Betty defended herself. "Everyone told me I was too soft, that I cling to a man, but that's not true. In my understanding, if people are together, they just can't remain indifferent to what's happening to each other." "But you weren't even together with Adam," her sister objected. "Well, yes, I'm not saying anything like that, and there's nothing to solve here, unfortunately. But you could have listened, said words of sympathy. Is that so difficult, Shirley?" "And that would have been enough for me," Betty explained to her sister, "especially since it's been only a short time since Stephen left. I didn't even consider myself a widow, and there couldn't be any talk of romantic relationships." "Oh, then he's just insensitive and not worth your time," Shirley summed up. "I'm not going to degrade myself anymore," Betty said sadly. "But you know, for the first time in the past few weeks, I felt alive." "Well, girls, did you have a heart-to-heart?" Rick's voice came. "I've settled everything. Today we can rest a little more, and tomorrow morning we'll hit the road." "Well, that's great," Shirley smiled. "Come on, Betty, freshen up. I'll go for a walk around the area, see what's interesting here." Betty still didn't want to go anywhere, but for the sake of her loved ones, she had to do it. Lying in bed, surrendering to oppressive thoughts, she found herself in the very same infantile position that her sister had just criticized her for regarding Adam. After all, she had to pull herself together as difficult days lay ahead, organizing Stephen's funeral. Betty dried her hair and began to get ready. Her head was still spinning, and even simple movements were difficult for her. She couldn't find the sedative pills that the administrator had given her, and she could feel herself starting to shake without them. At some point, Shirley entered the room, sat down on a chair, and looked guiltily at her sister for a few seconds. "What's wrong?" Betty asked suspiciously, knowing that such a look from her younger sister didn't bode well. "Betty, something strange is happening here," Shirley replied quietly, looking down. "I did something stupid, but then something inexplicable happened." "What are you mumbling about?" objected their father. "Come on, spill it." "Well, just promise you won't be angry," Shirley pleaded with Betty and her father. "So I peeked at this Adam's number in your phone and decided to call him." "Why? Who asked you to?" Betty suddenly exclaimed, sitting up sharply in bed. "Betty, don't be angry, please. Besides, I didn't reach him because... Anyway, I can't understand what it is, Betty. But something strange is definitely going on here," Shirley rattled on excitedly. "Okay, daughter, just explain calmly to us everything," Rick intervened again. "Well, in short, I'm sitting in the lobby, dialing the number. The call is going through, but no one answers. And at that very moment, the guy at the reception's phone rings. He took it out of his pocket, looked at it, and then put it back. Didn't decline it. Didn't answer it. Coincidence, right? I waited for a while and called again. And what do you think? The phone rang again for this guy, and he seemed to get annoyed and threw an irritated glance at the screen, then put the phone back in his pocket." Shirley finished her story and fell silent. "So you mean to say that one of the hotel staff has Adam's phone?" Rick and Betty exchanged glances and looked at Shirley again. "But that can't be, Shirley," Betty exclaimed. "Well, maybe he left it or lost it," suggested their father, realizing how absurd it all sounded. If that were the case, the hotel staff would have answered the call on the found phone long ago. And if he intended to appropriate the find for himself, on the contrary, he would have turned off the device and removed the SIM card from it. "Dad, Adam messaged me yesterday. He sent a message from his own number after he left. Therefore, he couldn't have left or lost the phone," Betty cut in. "And I don't have a single idea right now what this means at all." "How? What did this guy look like, Shirley? There are several of them there," Rick asked. Well, he looked ordinary, nothing remarkable, shrugged the sister. Let's go downstairs quietly. I'll show you him. Yes, let's go, agreed Betty. Daddy, will you keep us company? I'm starting to feel uneasy. They went downstairs and settled on the couch in the lobby. Behind the reception desk, facing the computer, sat Patrick. Next to him was an attractive blonde with a badge. She was talking to visitors, answering phone calls. Some new employee whom Betty saw here for the first time. Betty, there he is, sitting over there, Shirley whispered, pointing towards Patrick. Do you recognize him? Betty nodded, pondering how to clarify the situation without scaring the guy away. Just a moment, said Rick, putting on his glasses, scrutinizing Patrick's face. I know him. How could you know him, Dad? Betty frowned. He's the doctor from the hospital where you were lying, replied her father. Dad, what doctor? You're clearly mistaken, Shirley was surprised. Now hold on, my memory is actually fine, never let me down once, Rick insisted. Once I see someone, I remember them for life. This is Dr. Steve Cooper, who advised us to bring you, Betty, here and gave the phone number of this rehab center. Mom called and booked a place for you here. At that moment, Patrick stood up from behind the computer and immediately noticed that 3 pairs of eyes were staring at him with great curiosity. When he met Rick's gaze, the usual smile instantly vanished from his face. Pausing for a few seconds, he swiftly turned around and walked quickly into the staff area, the entrance to which was right behind the desk. Well, now we're convinced, and he recognized me too and immediately disappeared, the man concluded triumphantly. Something fishy, I don't understand. We'll find out now, Betty said confidently, and quickly walked to the reception. The blonde behind the desk was having a pleasant conversation on the phone, and Betty had to wait for several minutes, feeling impatient. She suppressed the urge to walk into that door herself, but that was definitely not an option. Betty didn't want to ruin everything. Finally, the girl hung up the phone and turned to Betty with a friendly smile. Excuse me, could you please call Patrick? She asked, trying to maintain a calm expression. I just saw him walk into that door a few minutes ago. Maybe I can help you? The blonde suggested. No, thank you. I specifically need Patrick, Betty insisted. The girl looked at her incredulously and walked into the room where the guy had disappeared, but she returned less than a minute later. He's not there, she shrugged. Apparently, he left through the staff entrance. Listen, could you give me his phone number? I really need to reach him urgently. Or find out where he went, please. Betty spoke hesitantly, unable to control her emotions. Sorry, but we don't give out personal numbers of employees, the blonde replied dryly. Well, maybe you could still explain what happened. Then I want to talk to the management of the rehabilitation center. Yes, something happened and it's urgent. Betty raised her voice. The management is in front of you, the girl smirked. Carolyn Hamilton at your service. So you're the owner's daughter? Betty asked incredulously. I'm his wife. This is our family business. And what does wife mean? As far as I know, his wife disappeared under mysterious circumstances last year, Betty muttered. And excuse me, what is the hotel owner's wife doing behind the reception desk? Sorry, aren't you the guest from room 212, right? I've already been told that you have some health issues, and we treat it with great understanding and do everything possible to help, Carolyn replied calmly. Betty stared at Carolyn Hamilton, unable to utter a word. Shirley and Rick silently watched this scene. I didn't disappear anywhere, Carolyn Hamilton continued, irritation creeping into her voice. I was at a 2-week training course in Switzerland. I just got back and I'm back to work. As always, I handle all the day-to-day matters behind the reception desk. I don't understand why this surprises you. We don't have a huge staff here. Any other questions? Sweetheart, let's step away for a moment, Betty whispered in her father's ear, who had appeared behind her. Oh, please excuse us. Shirley smiled at Carolyn Hamilton and gently nudged her older sister towards the elevator. It's nothing. If you need any help, be sure to ask, Shirley said to them. In Betty's room, she climbed onto the bed and wrapped herself in a blanket, trying to calm the tremors in her body. Shirley turned on the kettle and took out some cups. All right, let's go through this step by step, Rick began, sitting down beside them. Daddy, I just don't understand anything anymore, Betty whispered. My head is about to explode from all these thoughts. Something strange is definitely happening here, and I think I'm going crazy." "We'll figure it all out now," her father reassured her, patting her head. "By the way, I recently watched a movie where people were kidnapped like this, kept in a bunker, and subjected to medical experiments. They implanted new memories into their minds using special devices. After that, those people could be easily manipulated," Shirley shared, handing hot tea to her father and sister. "Wait a minute," Rick interrupted her. "We're not going to consider all these fantastic plots right now. Reality is much more complex." "Dad, I won't be surprised by any turn of events anymore," Betty spoke up. "People are disappearing without a trace from this rehabilitation center, including the owner's wife. And then some girl shows up here claiming to be his wife. Why should I believe her? Especially when Adam disappeared too, very unexpectedly. Everything was fine. And suddenly he starts sending me rude responses like, 'Don't bother me, I don't want to know you,' and so on. Maybe they're already experimenting on him in some lab?" Rick just shook his head. "We've established that those messages might not have been from him, considering the fact that Shirley wasn't mistaken about Adam's phone being with this Patrick." "There can be no mistake," Shirley interrupted her father, "especially since that guy, as soon as he saw Dad, ran away immediately." "Yes, that's the point," Betty exclaimed. "They're all somehow involved in the disappearance of people here, and now it has affected Adam too." "Wait, why do you even think people are disappearing here?" her father asked. "Take the example of the hotel owner's wife. She, as it turns out, is perfectly fine." Betty pondered, trying to remember. "Dennis," it struck her. "There's this interesting grandma living on this floor with her husband. She told me all about it." "So now the grandma is in on this gang too," Shirley chuckled. "I'll go ask her myself," Betty decided firmly. "I'll go alone and you guys stay here. Don't go anywhere or we might scare her off." The woman knocked on Dennis's door and she quickly opened it, immediately breaking into a smile. "Quiet, Betty." She put her finger to her lips. "My husband is sleeping after breakfast." "Oh, these pensioners." "Tell me, Dennis, where did you get the information that people are disappearing here?" Betty asked without preamble. "Suppose Shirley, Walter Hamilton's wife, hasn't disappeared and is currently at the front desk. Dennis, I spoke to her." "Wow, that's news." The woman's eyes widened. "Well, Patrick told me all about it. He works at the hotel. You know him. And then I told you." "Thank you, that's all I needed to find out," Betty replied. "Thanks again and give my regards to Greg when he wakes up." "Betty, where's Adam?" the neighbor asked. "I haven't seen him for 2 days." "You know, he disappeared suddenly too," Betty sadly replied, walking away. "Believe me, Betty, this man definitely couldn't have disappeared from you," Dennis whispered loudly after her. In the room, they waited eagerly for information. "So, what do we have in the end?" Rick pondered. "At the hospital, Mom and I randomly meet a young doctor. He directs Betty to this place. The doctor presumably turns out to be the same guy who works at this hotel at the reception. Well, personally, I have no doubt it's the same person, so he lured Betty here for some reason. Yeah, by the way," Betty added thoughtfully, "he was so friendly right away, showing special attention to both me and Adam. Whenever we crossed paths in the hallway, he always asked about my well-being, when I felt bad. Well, when Adam disappeared, even before I was told they found Stephen's body, this Patrick gave me sedative pills." "What other pills?" Rick and Shirley asked in unison. Betty reached for the bedside table and pulled out a glass vial. No label, no insert. "He just handed them to me, said it was local herbs," Betty muttered, realizing that for several days she had been taking something unknown. "And they put me in such a strange state, like I was dazed, constantly falling asleep." "Daughter!" exclaimed Rick Alexeyevich, slapping his knee. "How could you take pills from a stranger and drink them, especially when you have prescribed treatment from a doctor?" "I was too scared to think about it," Betty tried to justify herself. "I felt so bad, and Patrick instilled trust, sincerely sympathized, took them out of his drawer, handed them to me." "Well, now we need to understand again, what does he need all this for?" Shirley pondered. Even if he lured you, started giving you some prohibited drug, what's next? Well, to cause addiction and then sell that substance, a well-known scheme, Rick suggested. Ah, exactly, Betty agreed. Then it all adds up. It's just unclear what Adam has to do with this story. Well, maybe they're in cahoots. He deliberately got close to you on the bus, gained your trust. That's why Patrick has his phone, Shirley suggested. Right, exactly, Rick Alexeyevich confirmed. Look, you're lying in the hospital, a lonely, unhappy woman. No one mentioned that your husband disappeared without a trace. On the contrary, everyone knew you were stressed because of losing your husband. You didn't have much money, right? But you have a house. And Stephen left you his car and insured his life, so you're the beneficiary. How much does it all add up to if you sell everything? Several million minimum. People don't lose their lives for such sums. It's really all becoming clear to me now, said the father. The mosaic was complete. Betty couldn't bear to realize that everything that happened with Adam turned out to be a sham. She always felt like he knew her too well. But it was impossible for him to know so much in just a week. From her favorite song on the bus to his food preferences, he constantly showed her how similar they were to create the illusion of spiritual closeness. It was simply inhumane to exploit the vulnerability of a woman who had experienced such a tragedy. She was already at rock bottom, and these drugs, they would quickly ruin her physical health. Betty couldn't even cry, promising herself that she would cry out all her sorrow later. But now, they needed to expose these scoundrels. All right, I'm calling the investigator urgently, Betty said and reached for the phone. He's handling Stephen's case, but at least he'll advise us on what to do next because he knows my situation. Yes, that's right, call him, Shirley agreed, although it's probably a bit late already. And indeed, the policeman didn't answer after the first, or even after several calls. Okay, I have the mobile number of the second investigator, who told me they found the body. I'll call him, Betty persisted. I have a friend in the police, he's a chief, I'll call him, Rick added. Douglas Watson, my classmate. I think I've mentioned him before, right? Hopefully he'll remember me. With these words, the father left the room with the phone in his hand, and Betty called Keith Perkins. He didn't answer right away. By the hoarse voice of the man, she realized she woke him up. Keith, I'm sorry to call you so late, but I have an emergency. And who are you? He asked. I'm Betty Roberts, she replied, feeling embarrassed. You called me recently about my husband, Stephen. Oh, right. I didn't save your number in my phone book. What happened? Keith Perkins asked. Betty explained the essence of what happened to her. The lieutenant silently listened and, as it seemed to her, was not surprised at all. Apparently, such stories were not new in his practice. Keith Perkins asked her not to leave and, if possible, not to leave the room. He promised to personally contact the police in that region and call her back for further instructions. Betty thanked Keith again, apologized, and hung up. At that moment, Rick entered the room speaking on the phone. He covered the receiver with his hand and asked Betty, what's the name of the second investigator you just called? Keith Perkins, she answered, surprised. Douglas, can you hear me? Her father returned to the phone conversation. His name is Keith Perkins. What? Keith Perkins, I'm telling you. Are you sure? Well, that's odd. Just wait. Let me talk to my daughter now. I'll call you back. He hung up, turned to his questioning daughters, and slowly said, Douglas Watson, the head of the investigative department, just told me that there's no investigator named Keith Perkins in their department. Moreover, he's been working in the investigative department for 20 years and knows every employee by name, even the cleaners. They don't have anyone with that surname on their staff. And there never has been. The father called Douglas again and explained in more detail what had happened. After hanging up, he gave clear instructions to his daughters. So, we're not leaving the hotel for now. Douglas will soon send his people here. Send him Keith Perkins and Adam's phone numbers, and I'll send him Patrick's or Steve Cooper's number. We're not exactly sure what he's called. When they wrote down the numbers on a piece of paper, they were surprised to discover that the fake investigator Keith Perkins and the equally fake administrator Patrick had the same phone number. Several hours passed. It was raining outside. The rain was heavy, noisy, and unsettling, and now Betty was feeling particularly heavy. She needed silence. The slightest noise made her anxious and nervous. She approached the window to close it tighter and not hear the raindrops beating on the windowsill, when suddenly she saw a person running down the path to the hotel. His silhouette seemed familiar to Betty. As the man got closer, she could see him better. Without a doubt, it was Adam. Following him about 100 meters away, another man was running, clearly trying to catch up with him. "Dad, surely Adam is there!" Betty shouted, swung open the balcony door and rushed outside, ignoring the pouring rain. She noticed that something was wrong with Adam. Betty saw his torn clothes and bruises on his face, but that wasn't the worst part. The second man caught up with Adam, and now she could see him clearly. It was Stephen. Just yesterday, Betty would have thought it was another hallucination, but from her father's and Shirley's faces, she could tell they saw Stephen too. Alive, alert, and furious. The events unfolded as if in slow motion. Stephen caught up with and knocked Adam down, her father running out of the room to help, Shirley's hands holding Betty, who was screaming in horror. A police car, from which two men in bulletproof vests with rifles jumped out and rushed toward Stephen and Adam, who were locked in a fierce struggle. Betty barely remembered how they drove home. It felt like it took only a few minutes. She only closed her eyes for a second, and when she opened them, the car was already pulling up at the police station. Adam was taken away in an ambulance. When Betty woke up, she saw a message from him saying he was okay, just scratches and bruises. He was on his way home. The day before, she found out that on that fateful day, Patrick woke him up and said that someone had come for him and was waiting nearby the rehabilitation center. When Adam went outside the hotel grounds, he was knocked unconscious, and he woke up in some basement with no explanations, no threats, and no hope of rescue. There was water and stale bread in the basement, so Adam concluded they weren't planning to kill him yet. 2 or 3 days later, he managed to escape when one of his captors opened the door to throw in some more food. That person turned out to be Stephen. A struggle ensued between the two men, but Adam managed to escape. The place was right behind the rehabilitation center. That's why Adam ran towards the rehabilitation center. During the subsequent events, Betty was there personally, but now she had to get answers to all her questions. There were so many of them. "You know I was wrong about your witch," Shirley smirked as they waited for the investigator. "Turns out she didn't deceive you, Betty. Look how she brought Stephen back to this reality. Now you can leave the most truthful review of her work on the website." Despite her sister's sarcastic tone, Betty laughed loudly for the first time in a long time. "And your Stephen, a professional marriage swindler," investigator Peter began his story. "There are so many of them nowadays. Nobody is surprised anymore. Guys don't even make an effort. Overly trusting women believe in any fairy tale and willingly hand over their money. Sometimes it seems so obvious. How could you fall for it? But the victim completely loses common sense. Wait, but what's the scam?" Betty still didn't understand the situation. "He didn't ask me for anything. He spent his own money. He doesn't seem like a gold digger at all." "Let me explain," the investigator interrupted her. "The thing is, Stephen is a real player. It's just boring to deceive trusting ladies like that. And how much can you get from them? Yes, women take out loans for their supposedly distressed lovers, but those are not big sums. Stephen wanted scale. He wanted his catch to be worth millions, you see. And apparently, he got immense pleasure from the process, from his inventiveness." "It's funny that someone associates me with scale and millions," Betty smiled sadly. "Well, millions don't necessarily mean bundles of cash in a safe, right?" the investigator continued. "Stephen started his path back in his youth. After school, he trained as a nurse, got a job at a hospital, thought about going to college to become a doctor, and then realized there was a much shorter path to wealth. In the hospital, he targeted his victims, mostly older ladies, although young girls also fell for his charm. He wasn't a doctor, but somehow he had access to medical records. He quickly figured out who to pay attention to and who to avoid. Imagine, some weak girl lying in the ward, and then this charming guy walks in with a drip. Not a grumpy old lady, but a smiling, handsome man. He gives injections so gently, does bandages so tenderly, and he's so considerate, and the girl falls for it. Betty listened, finding it hard to imagine that the story was about her husband. He always seemed authoritative, calm, so it was difficult to imagine him groveling before patients, even if it was in the past. Betty nodded to the investigator, and he continued his story. Stephen and his victims would start relationships that continued after her discharge. You see, the scheme is classic. After some time, when the lady fell in love and got attached to him, he suddenly needed money, usually for what appeared to be an urgent operation in his own hospital. Women would give up their savings, take out loans. He created the appearance of going in for surgery, and then, poof, he disappeared. And it seemed like there was nothing to claim back. They weren't lending him money. They were sincerely helping. And each time he found a new victim. In traumatology, there's a constant flow of candidates, new faces every day. Few people end up there again. In general, even when the most aggrieved ladies exposed this scheme, there was nothing to prosecute him for. They gave him the money themselves, and there was no documentary evidence of the funds transfer. So you mean he managed to get some big sums through this method? Betty was surprised. You have no idea what big sums. Peter nodded to her. The income from these scams was 10 times higher than his official salary, and with each time, he became more inventive and gradually began to practice parallel relationships with several women simultaneously. If it suddenly came to light, he immediately dumped the lady and the next one took her place. Gradually, our swindler saved up for a car, rented a better apartment, and didn't look like a poor nurse to women anymore. He lied to everyone that he was studying medicine, developing some business, and worked in the hospital out of love for medicine. Okay, but I still don't understand. How does this elaborate scheme relate to me at all? And here we come to the most interesting part. This case definitely gets my personal Oscar this year. The investigator even rubbed his hands, clearly enjoying the unraveling of the crime. You see, Betty, Stephen's thirst for money was so strong that all sorts of moral boundaries were already trampled. He started a romance with a young doctor from oncology and often visited her department. Of course, it was just an excuse, but for what? Right, to gain access to terminally ill cancer patients. His usual scheme wasn't viable there, and he had to be more inventive. There was a long game going on. He was looking for someone he could marry. Oh my God, I feel really bad from this turn of events, Betty murmured, pressing her hand to her chest. No, if you're talking about oncology, that was just one episode, the investigator reassured her. He found a woman there with a serious diagnosis who had no relatives at all. She was from an orphanage, had a government apartment, and made a decent living herself. So Stephen pretended to have an unearthly love for her, and he was really good at it. A couple of months later, they got married. He pretended to care for her tenderly, although there wasn't much to care about since she spent half her time in the hospital. She didn't have long, and she was happy that for her last months, she had such an otherworldly man by her side. So she left everything to him in her will, and Stephen became the owner of a 2-bedroom apartment and a small country house. He sold all of it and headed to the States. There, he could charm ladies with much bigger sums, you see. But it was more difficult because such specimens were often less gullible. It required much more time and effort. And then he met you. Oh, and I turned out to be gullible, Betty sadly confirmed. It's not just that, the investigator shook his head. You were easy to manipulate. Over the years of his scams, he became a true professional, a subtle psychologist, at the same time completely cynical and unprincipled. Waiting for the death of a poor cancer patient, that's petty and uninteresting. No thrill, you understand? But leading a woman to her death who wasn't planning to die, that's the pinnacle. You wouldn't believe it, but during the interrogation today, Stephen's eyes lit up when he told all of this. He wasn't just unrepentant. He was proud of his grand scheme. You know, I can guess what it's about, Betty replied. So he wanted to drive me to suicide to get all our joint property, right? Yes. When you, your father, and your sister began to suspect Patrick and Adam, you were on the right track, catching the cause. But you went in the wrong direction with your guesses because you didn't know all the details of the case. When you got married, Stephen suggested selling his and your apartment to buy a big country house. And you agreed, not paying attention to the details. And why worry? According to the terms of your marriage contract, in case of his death, all joint property would go to you and vice versa. In general, he completely dulled your vigilance. But that must have been very difficult to pull off, Betty said doubtfully. Involving so many people? Oh, come on, it only seems that way to you because you were on the other side of the barricade. Besides Patrick, Stephen had no other accomplices and he didn't need them. This Patrick is a professional actor. He worked as an entertainer at children's parties, voiced something there. And here was such a powerful production with huge payment. But he also pretended to be a doctor in front of your parents. All it took was putting on a white coat and confidently walking through the hallway. He also called you in the role of my non-existent assistant Keith Perkins, just changed his voice slightly, and that's it. And by the way, he took control of the entire game at the rehabilitation center. All those voices, music, the portrait he first brought to the room and then hid after entering before you. They came up with these moves together with Stephen, who knew you well and understood much better where to press, how to hook, how to demoralize you, Betty. In short, if you hadn't decided on suicide, they would have helped you. The woman's mind was buzzing with dozens of questions, realizing that the investigator wouldn't answer them. She replayed the events of the past few weeks in her head, and could barely distinguish what was real from what was orchestrated. "Can I talk to this Stephen?" she asked. "Well, it's not standard procedure, you still have a precise stake. But if you really need to, come earlier tomorrow. They'll just bring him back from the interrogation season. I'll give you the opportunity to chat." "In my presence, of course," the police officer replied. That evening, Betty called Adam and they talked for over an hour. The invisible shackles that had restrained her all this time, preventing her from feeling and seeing the essence, finally fell off. Adam learned about their meeting with Stephen tomorrow and offered to drive her, and the woman gladly agreed. Betty sat in the investigator's office and didn't recognize the person she had loved with all her heart not long ago. No. Outwardly, this Stephen hadn't changed much, but his eyes were completely unfamiliar. "You're brave, I must say," he sneered, smiling crookedly. "Volunteering to talk to me. Do you think I'll go to jail? Never. I didn't kill anyone or rob anyone. You foolish women. You handed me the money yourselves, so I'm clean. I even executed the kidnapping of your new man, Patrick, and you haven't even buried your husband yet, but you're already having an affair with another man." Betty listened to him and understood. Stephen's sole purpose was to humiliate her, to provoke her again so he could manipulate her, even while in handcuffs in the investigator's office. But this time, he wouldn't succeed. "So, you're most afraid of criminal punishment?" Betty calmly asked. "I can't even comprehend how much life has already punished you, right?" "You have no idea how much I enjoyed this whole show," he said with undisguised pleasure, as if mentally ill. "I was the main actor, director, and producer. I watched you, poor thing, from the woods when you cried by the lake. How your parents fussed over you, all because of their unearthly love for me. And what Patrick and I arranged later at the rehab center. It was just wow. Music in the woods, whispers from the balcony. I could barely contain my laughter. If it weren't for your Adam showing up, everything would have worked out perfectly, Betty. You wandered around there like an amoeba." "So you're now outright admitting that you wanted to drive me to suicide, right?" Betty clarified. "Where did I say that?" Stephen protested. "How did I directly say that? Are you hearing voices again? I didn't say anything like that. I was just playing you and getting tremendous pleasure. Officer, and you too, make a note. I was just joking. Sure, the prank was a bit harsh, but you can't put me in jail for it. You should be looking for Patrick anyway. He's the one who kidnapped someone. He wanted to frame my wife for drugs, maybe just her lungs, but still. Impersonated someone else in the hospital. That's a real criminal while I was just kidding." "Do you have anything human left in you?" Betty whispered, overcoming her disgust. "Who are you? You're a worthless, divorced woman. No one needs you. Did you really think you could attract a decent man?" It seems Betty got a bit ahead of herself about her own invincibility. But she had to hold on until the end. "I believe my genuine love for you will forever remain the greatest achievement in your pathetic life. I doubt you'll ever have anything like it again. You're a pitiful person who could only obtain a woman's love through such complex schemes. Because the real you is worthless, Betty said these words to the police officer and left the room. I hope everything went okay? Adam asked her, looking into Betty's eyes with concern. Honestly, I was really worried that you'd get nervous there. That's why I didn't want you to talk to him at all, even with the police present. Adam, I'm fine, Betty replied, kissing him on the cheek. But only now have I realized that I've been freed from some burden. That expression doesn't convey all of my feelings. I feel like my inner chains have been lifted, Adam. It's as if I was in a cage myself and now I suddenly find myself free. But then I'm very happy for you. Adam smiled tenderly and kissed her on the tip of her nose. Only the best lies ahead. But you know, Betty hesitated. One phrase from Stephen really stung. He said, "Did you really think you could attract any decent man?" It was so hurtful to hear, as if I had no worth at all. Do you actually think you should listen to the words of that scumbag? Adam asked Betty. He just humiliated you out of habit, as a parting shot, that's all. Again, he did it out of his own weakness, out of impotence. Do you think so? Betty brightened. I just haven't learned how to fully resist him yet. Or rather, people like him. Betty, just so you have no doubts, I'll confess something to you. Adam sighed embarrassedly, as if gathering his strength. Well, when I first saw you on the bus, I immediately knew you were mine. Yes, you weren't in the best shape then, but you were still incredibly attractive, Betty. Then you told me your story, and I realized that rushing things with you was definitely not a good idea. But do you remember that night when you stayed over at my place, when you were sleeping? I accidentally put my hand on your shoulder. You probably didn't even feel it in your sleep, but at that moment, I realized that I